Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I want to apologize for the delay. I'm going to catch my breath and we're going to start without further ado. So my name is Elisheva. I'm not Tamar Darmon, but I do work with her. And I'm here at the Begin Center. We're very happy to be partnering again with the Jerusalem Parliament, and tonight especially with the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research and with Barutina, a unique initiative of the Jerusalem municipality. And I want to welcome you to our lecture with Lior Schillat, who it is my pleasure to introduce. And again, thank you for joining us, and we're sorry for the delay. So, Lior Schillat was born and raised in Herzliya and was drafted into the Nachal Infantry Brigade. His army service completed, he worked as an aide to Ariel Sharon, then leader of the opposition. When Sharon was elected prime minister in 2001, Lior took a position in the prime minister's office, where 5 years later, he was appointed head of the Department for Policy Implementation, supervising the execution of complex long-term government decisions. After working at a boutique investment firm for several years, he became the liaison of the Israeli Ministry of Economy to the International Financial Institute based in Washington, D.C. Upon his return to Israel in 2015, Lior became the Director General of a research institute focused on connections between connections between technology and national security. From November 2016, he's been the Director General of the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, a Jerusalem-based think tank. Lior's main goal in his new role is to create modern, innovative, and reactive institutes that would provide a base of knowledge to decision makers wishing to advance Jerusalem and the state of Israel. His dream is to help make Jerusalem the light among the nations that it is meant to be. Lior, thank you very much for being with us tonight. And again, thank you to our audience. And we're going to start right away.
Thanks, Elisheva, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here again in an event of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, together with our institute, the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, the Jerusalem Parliament, and Barutina of the Jerusalem Municipality. What we're going to do is that I'm going to go with you through a few facts that might be interesting about Jerusalem, what's happening in Jerusalem in the last 50 years. And if we'll have some time at the end, we'll even focus on what's happening in Jerusalem during the 2020 COVID-19 crisis. So I'll just go to my presentation. There we go. So what I'm gonna tell you today is based on data that is collected in the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research for the last 42 years. The institute was established in 1978, and it's based on some of our publications. The main one is the Jerusalem Statistical Yearbook. Here you can see the front of the Jerusalem Facts and Trends a publication that is published together with the Jerusalem Statistical Yearbook. And basically they're looking at, we're publishing some interesting facts and trends on what's happening in Jerusalem every day. We usually issue it on Jerusalem Day, the day that Jerusalem was reunited in 1967. And we're trying to shed light on some of the interesting aspects of what we see as the most fascinating city in Israel, for sure, maybe around the world. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through five facts that I think that could be interesting for you, and then I'll try and leave some room for questions. The first thing that you should know about Jerusalem, in Israeli terms, it's a big city. Okay, Jerusalem is twice the size of Tel Aviv, 3 times the size of Haifa. The city, in fact, is so big that it has 10% of the total population of the state of Israel. It was not always like that. Jerusalem was not always the biggest city in Israel. As you can see in this graph, when Israel was established and up until the mid-70s, actually Tel Aviv was Israel's largest city. But then, as you can see in the blue line, somewhere around the mid-50s, Jerusalem passed Tel Aviv as the biggest city in Israel. And ever since, It's just growing and growing and growing to the fact that today, as I mentioned, it's getting closer to 1 million people. It's twice the size of Tel Aviv and 3 times the size of Haifa that also appears on the bottom of this graph. So we spoke about the fact that Jerusalem is big. Now let's talk about the fact that Jerusalem is very diverse. As you can see on this pie chart, when you look at the population in Israel, you can see that there is a very clear dominant group. This is the group of what we call a non-Haredi Israeli Jews, or maybe it's a mixture of modern Orthodox and secular Jews. But however, there are some people that would call it the Zionist group. But however you would choose to call this group, this is a group that in Israel contains something like 68% of the total population in the country. You can see, and that includes, of course, both Jews and Arab. Then you can see that the Arab population in Israel is around 21%, and another 11% are part of the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi population in Israel. Then on the other pie chart, the one that looks at Jerusalem in 2017, you can see a completely different story. You can see that actually in Jerusalem, the Haredi population is 27% rather than 10 and then 11% in all of Israel. You can see that 38% of the city is Arab population, and you can see that the secular or the non-Haredi Jewish population, meaning secular and modern Orthodox, are 35% of the population in Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem is a city of minorities. Okay, while in Israel there is a very clear dominant group, in Jerusalem you can see 3 big minorities that each one is struggling to get some dominance, but has to have some kind of coalition with the other 2 tribes if it wants to get some kind of a consensus about what to do in the city. And that's what makes Jerusalem very unique. I should say that actually in Israel, there are not many cities that have the situation that you can see here in the graph. Now, what I did here in this specific graph is I took the graph before, and then I separate the population into 2. Before we saw it was separated into 3. Now I separated it into 2 groups. One in what seems to be kind of an orange. This is what, or let's start with the other one that is, let's call it red. Okay, so the red groups are people that grew up in Israel according to what I call the Zionist narrative, meaning those are people that when they went to school and later to the army service, they grew up on a certain narrative that believes that Judaism is both nationality and religion, and that this country belongs to the Jews, and that Zionism is the right narrative, the right way of life for Israelis. In the orange group, you see groups, in the orange color, you see groups that did not grow up on this narrative, Arabs and ultra-Orthodox. And as you can see, while in Israel, this group is a minority, in Jerusalem, it's actually a majority. And as I mentioned before, this is a very unique situation. You don't have any other city in Israel, but of course, Arab or ultra-Orthodox cities, in which the secular plus modern Orthodox group is actually a minority. And a lot of the trends that I'll show you later are affected from the fact that Jerusalem's combination of population is different than what you would see in other cities around Israel. I mentioned before that Jerusalem is Israel's largest city, but we should know that even when we look at these groups that I mentioned before, at each of these groups, each one is huge for itself. So let's start with the Arab population in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there are, as I mentioned before, 38% of Arabs. There are around 350,000 out of the total 920,000 is Jerusalemites, sorry. So just to give you a proportion, Israel's largest Arab city is the city of Nazareth. And in the city of Nazareth, there are less than 80,000 Arabs. So the Arab population of Jerusalem for itself is more than 4 times the size of the largest Arab city in Israel. In fact, if it was a separated city, meaning if East Jerusalem, the Arab part of Jerusalem, would have been a separate city, it would have been the 3rd largest city in Israel, bigger than the entire population of the city of Haifa. You see here in the graph in front of you, the city of Haifa likes to portray itself as the city of all religion, etc., etc. But as you can see, of course, the Arab population of Haifa is just 11%. And while Jerusalem is the real diverse city, and sorry for being a bit arrogant about it, but by Jerusalem is really the pluralistic city, in Haifa still you have a vast majority of either secular or modern Orthodox Jews. In Jerusalem, that is not the case. Here in the graph, you can see also what happened during the years in the combination, in the ratio between the Jewish and the Arab population in Jerusalem. So in 1967, when Israel annexed those 70 square kilometers that we call East Jerusalem, and I'll talk about it later, when they were annexed to Jerusalem, they contained 26% of the total population of the city. And then the government of Israel started a policy that its goal was to encourage Jews to move from the coast, from the Tel Aviv metropolitan area into Jerusalem. The goal of that was to make sure that this ratio between Jews and Arab would not change, and actually the Jews would continue being the majority in Jerusalem. But as you can see in this graph, that was not a very successful policy. The reason for that is for two reasons. A, the natural growth of Arabs in Jerusalem was significantly higher than the one of Jews in Jerusalem. But B, when the government built those huge neighborhoods in the area that was annexed in 67, trying to encourage Jews from the area of Tel Aviv to move to Jerusalem, or from all over Israel to move to Jerusalem, they didn't take into account that when they build these neighborhoods, they're actually encouraging a massive wave of immigration of builders from the city of Hebron, south of Jerusalem, into Jerusalem. So in fact, a policy that was meant to encourage, to enlarge the number of Jews in Jerusalem, actually enlarged not just the number of Jews, but also the numbers of Arabs, to the fact that today, 38% of the people in Jerusalem, as I mentioned before, are a part of the Palestinian population, while 62% are Jews. One thing that I said before is that one of the reasons for the growth among the Palestinian population, the Arab population in Jerusalem, was a bigger fertility rate among the Muslim women in Jerusalem. You look here at the numbers of the year 2000, and you can actually see that in the year 2000, the average number of children for Muslim women was 4.5, while the average number of Jewish children for a Jewish mother was 3.8. But look what happened in the last 18 years. Look what a change happened. The Arab population fertility rate went down from 4.5 to 3.2. This is incredible in such a short period. At the same time, the Jewish fertility rate went up from 3.8 to 4.4. Now this mix, or this change between the Jewish fertility rate and the Arab fertility rate, it comes from very different reasons. Among the Jewish population, it comes from a change in the mixture of population, meaning a rise in the percentage of ultra-Orthodox among the Jews. The average numbers of fertility rate among Haredi women, ultra-Orthodox women, is 6.7. So clearly, as the number or as the percentage of ultra-Orthodox women is growing, clearly also the number of children among the entire Jewish population is growing. Amongst the Arabs, you can see a cultural change. So while in the year 2000, 4.5 sounds like something right for an Arab woman, in the year 2008, in the year 2018, it dropped all the way to 3.2. And that's part of a whole cultural change, shift that is happening in the entire Arab world. The numbers that we see in countries like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like Jordan, like the West Bank, are very similar to the numbers that we see in Jerusalem. Now let's look on the Jewish population in Jerusalem. And here again, you can see a bit of a mirroring of what we saw before. Here, we created an infographic that is also dividing the Jewish population between secular and the modern Orthodox, or what we call Dati Leumi here in Israel. So you can see that in Jerusalem, the situation is very different than the rest of Israel. While in Israel, the seculars are by far the largest group, having 2/3 of the total population, while the Haredim are around 10%. When we look at Jerusalem, those numbers change. And basically in Jerusalem, those three, let's call them Jewish tribes of seculars, modern Orthodox and Haredi, are more or less third. And it's worth mentioning that the numbers that you're seeing now are among people above the age of 20. And since, as I mentioned before, the Haredim have a lot of children, then you can imagine that if we're adding the children, the Haredi group is growing a bit higher, around 42% more or less. You can also see in this infographic the situation in Tel Aviv and in Haifa, and there you can understand that among the Jews of Tel Aviv and Haifa, seculars are by far the largest group. They're higher than 80%, while the Haredim are very small groups, 4% in Haifa, around 1% at all in Tel Aviv. So we spoke about the fact that Jerusalem is big, and we spoke about the fact that it's diverse. Actually, here in the Jerusalem Institute, we use the term diversity when we talk about Jerusalem, diversity written with city, C-I-T-Y, to explain how diverse is this city. Now let's talk a little bit about the age groups. The city is a very young city. Here you can see the way that our education system is divided, but before talking about the different streams in the education in Jerusalem, it's worth looking at this number. 286,900 is the number of students here in Jerusalem between the age of 3 and 18. And just to give you a proportion, if the education system in Jerusalem would have been a separated city, it would have been the 3rd largest city in Israel. There are more students in Jerusalem than there are people in the city of Haifa, which is the 3rd largest city in Israel. And that's, of course, already gives you a proportion of how many children we have here in Jerusalem. You cannot compare it to any other city in Israel. When we look at who are those children, so you can see, of course, that the largest education system is the Arab system, but the Haredi system, you remember that the Arabs are 38% of the city, while the Haredim are 27%. And yet the number of children is almost equal between the two systems. And that shows you how many more children the Haredim have compared to the Arab population. And of course, way beyond is the state and state religious education, what we call Mamlachti and Mamlachti Dati. And in those two systems put together, you will find around 65,000 children. It should be mentioned that all those systems are growing, including the state and the state religious education. However, the Haredi and the Arab are growing in a much faster rate than the state and state religious education system. Here in this, this is what we call an age pyramid, okay? An age pyramid gives you an understanding of the proportion between the different age groups in every population. So the first pyramid that I'm showing you is the Jewish compared to Arab population. In the Jewish population, you can see some very interesting phenomenon. First of all, look at this group, okay? People that are between the age of 50 to the age of 64. And you can see that the slides here are jumping a bit outside. What you can actually see here is the big wave of immigration that I mentioned before that happened in the 70s after 67, when the state of Israel built those huge neighborhoods all around Jerusalem, and people moved to Jerusalem from all over Israel. Then we'll talk later about some other interesting thing when we talk about the Jewish population, but one thing that is very clear is the number of children. Look at this, at the bar of children between the age of 0 and 5, and you can see that it's a very, very, very big bar, okay, significantly bigger than the bars of the older population. In the Arab sector, however, you can see that the bar of 0 till 4 and 5 till 9 are almost equal. And that's the first hint to what I showed you before, to the fact that the fertility rate amongst the Arab population in Jerusalem is dropping and dropping and dropping. And you can already see it in the fact that unlike the Jewish population, in the Arab population, those two bars are almost equal. Now let's have a look inside the Jewish population itself, now divided to ultra-Orthodox and the general Jewish population, again, modern Orthodox and secular put together. So here again, you can see very clear this group among the general Jewish population of the immigrants that came in the 70s and 80s. Another very dominant group among this non-Haredi Jews is people, young adults between the age of 20 and 35. Those are students. We have 40,000 students here in Jerusalem, students in the sense of students in the university. Okay, Jerusalem is actually a very attractive city for people that are coming to the Hebrew University, Betzalel, and other colleges that are spread around the city. And then again, you can see that even among the general Jewish population, the non-Haredi Jewish population, the age group of 0 to 4 is a very dominant one. In the Haredim, however, you can see how much dominant is this group. It's actually, it broke our bar, meaning it went all the way above 15%. And then you can see that actually in a younger age, even children in a younger age are in much smaller groups. And then when we come to the ages of 25 to 29, you can see groups that are even smaller than the non-Haredi people in the city. So we spoke about the fact that Jerusalem is big, and we spoke about the fact that it's diverse, and we spoke about the fact that it's young. Now let's talk about a little bit about the economy in Jerusalem. Participation rate in the labor force is basically people that are waking up in the morning and they're going to work, either because they have a job place or because they're unemployed and they're seeking for a job place. Who is not part of the participation rate, who is not part of the labor force, could be either people that are not looking for a job because they're a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad. They could be students that are fortunate enough and their parents are paying for their tuition. They could be, of course, people that are studying in the yeshiva, okay, Haredi people that are studying in the yeshiva. All of them are not part of the participation rate. So look at the labor force. Let's start first from Jewish women. You can see that the participation rate among Jewish women is around 80%. This is a very high participation rate. But when we look at the men, we can see actually that it's smaller than the participation rate among Jewish women. That's not something that is, you don't usually see that in Western countries. And the reason for that is, of course, the Haredi men that are going to yeshiva and they're not part of the participation rate. So 25% of the Jewish men in Jerusalem are not part of the participation rate. Again, if we're going to the Arab population, we look at the Arab men, 81%. That's a normal number you would see in many Western countries. But when we look at the women, then we see a very low number of 27%. And that's because most of the Arab women are what we call stay-at-home moms. They decide, for many reasons that of course I can elaborate if someone is interested, they decide not to be part of the labor force. And here I'll just throw a number from a research that was done in our institute by a researcher, Yamit Naftali. She tried to understand what would happen if we would manage to close the gap between the participation rate among Arab women in Jerusalem and the participation rate among Arab women in Israel. Now, it's worth mentioning, of course, that even the participation rate among Arab women in Jerusalem is relatively low, around 40%, 42%. But closing this gap of 15% would add to the economy of East Jerusalem, the Arab economy of Jerusalem, $500 million shekel every year. We're talking that the total salaries of all the people all the Arabs in Jerusalem is around 5.3 billion shekel. And only by closing this gap between participation among Arab women in the city and Arab women in Israel, we can add an extra almost 10% to the GDP of East Jerusalem. And that's, of course, a very significant number. And that's definitely a number that is worthwhile looking. So we spoke about the fact that we have a lot of children in Jerusalem, and we spoke about the fact that participation rates are relatively low, mainly among ultra-Orthodox men and Arab women. And if we're combining those two facts, what we're actually getting is a very, very poor city. Those are very sad numbers, and I want you to look at them. When you look at the numbers of poor, and by poor, I'm talking about people that live below the Israeli poverty line, you understand that in Jerusalem, 25% of the Jews, meaning 1 out of every 4 Jews, and 78% of the Arabs, meaning 8 out of every 10 Arabs in the city live below poverty line. And in general, we're talking about something like 45%, meaning almost half of this entire city of almost 1 million people that live below the poverty line. Here is another number to try and demonstrate how many poor people we have here in the city. 20% of the total number of people below poverty line in the entire state of Israel live in Jerusalem. So before COVID-19, when we used to accept a delegation in our institute to speak about the different challenges of the city, and they would tell me about a project that they're doing to fight poverty in Jisr al-Zarqa or Netivot or other cities around Israel, I would tell them, listen, of course, everything that you're doing is blessed. However, if you really want to fight the challenge of poverty, the place to do it is in Jerusalem. Because if you'll manage to do something really good in Jerusalem, you'll manage to tap 20% of the entire country. And that's, of course, not a number that you'll get anywhere else in the state of Israel. One thing that should be mentioned when we talk about economy is that, of course, not everything is bad. So in parallel to the fact that here we have quite a lot of pockets of poverty, and that's also something that should be discussed, because poverty among ultra-Orthodox and Arabs is not exactly the kind of poverty that we used to see in Western countries. But putting that aside, we need to remember that parallel to that, we have a very flourishing economy in Jerusalem. In fact, high-tech center in Jerusalem, as you can see in this graph, are growing and growing as time is passing, and there is a lot of incentive by the government for the high-tech companies in Israel. Out of the 3 largest exits that happened in the state of Israel, 2 of them were companies from Jerusalem. Jerusalem became in the last 5 years the biggest biomedical center in Israel. There are few companies that are what we call unicorn that started from Jerusalem. The last one of them, Oracle, is going to be a PO in the Nasdaq stock exchange in a few weeks for the net worth of $3 billion. So definitely it's important to understand that while on one side Jerusalem is struggling with this challenge of poverty, on the other side it has a lot of very encouraging signs when we talk about the economy of the city. So we spoke about the fact that the city is big and the fact that it's diverse, about the fact that it's young, and also we spoke a little bit about the fact that it's poor. And put all together, if it was not clear until now, we're talking about a relatively complicated city. Jerusalem is complicated. That's part of the charm of the city. One thing that we need to understand is that when we talk about East Jerusalem, which is a term that is being used quite a lot when we talk about Jerusalem, we're actually talking about the bigger part of Jerusalem. So here in this infographic map in front of you, you can see East Jerusalem here on light green and West Jerusalem here on a bit of a darker green. And you understand East Jerusalem is a term that is being used in dual meaning. One meaning is the entire area that was annexed to Jerusalem in 1967. And the other meaning is only the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem. So you can see that if we're talking about East Jerusalem in the the bigger term, meaning the entire area, you can see that it contains not only Arab population, but also 220,000 Jews. Those are the Jews that moved to those neighborhoods that I mentioned before, the big neighborhoods that were built after 67 during the 70s and the 80s. Some of these neighborhoods are the size of a medium-sized city in Israel. So, for example, the neighborhood of Ramot here has around 45 to 50,000 people. That's bigger than the city of Tiberias. The neighborhood of Gilo here in the south of the city has something like 35,000 people. That's the size of the city of Tzefat, of Safed. So we're talking about really big neighborhoods that contain altogether 220,000 Jews. And if it's put together, the Jewish population of East Jerusalem and the Arab population of East Jerusalem, you're getting actually the biggest city in Israel. So if East Jerusalem was a separated city, it would have been the largest city in Israel. It's bigger than Tel Aviv, and it's of course bigger than West Jerusalem, as you can see in the infographic in front of you. And that's here we try to explain, when we talk about complexity, we try to understand how it looks really in real life. So these are the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem and around it. And here you can see the Jewish neighborhoods. The darker color represent the Haredi neighborhood. The lighter color are either mixed or secular modern Orthodox neighborhoods. And that's how it looks like. So you can see this mosaic, this collage of Jewish and Arab neighborhoods, mainly in the area of East Jerusalem, which is this U here, this bump up to the north. And you can understand, of course, that when we talk about East and West Jerusalem, we need to understand that those neighborhoods are intertwined, one next to the other, Jewish and Arabs living side by side. By the way, not in the same neighborhood, but neighborhood next to neighborhood. And here is also an interesting fact when we talk about East Jerusalem. So in 1967, when Israel decided to annex those 70 square kilometers of East Jerusalem, at the time with 26% of the total population of the city, the Arabs of East Jerusalem got what we call a residency. They didn't get an Israeli citizenship, they got an Israeli residency. When I explained it to the Americans, the best way to explain it is that they got some kind of a green card, okay? So when you have an Israeli residency rather than citizenship, you get all the rights of an Israeli citizen, but free. You don't have an Israeli passport. You have something that's called laissez-passer. You don't have the right to vote to the Israeli parliament, to the Knesset. You can only vote to the municipality. And residency can be revoked, while citizenship is very hard, almost impossible to revoke a citizenship. Residency can be revoked if the government managed to prove that you don't live inside Israel. So if someone moved from the city of Jerusalem to the city of Ramallah, which is 10 kilometers to the north of the city, he is no longer entitled to the residency. And in the past, they used to revoke the residency. In the last few years, they don't do that. What happened was that for many reasons, and if you want, I'll elaborate about it in the Q&A part, the Arabs decided to keep the residency, and in general, most of them, almost 100% of them, did not apply to the Israeli citizenship, although they had the right for that. And you can see here in the graph that but a small jump in the beginning of the unified Jerusalem period around here, from 1975 and up until 2003, the numbers of Jerusalem Arabs that decided to apply from the residency to the citizenship was almost none, and the number that were approved, of course, were very low. But look what happened from 2003 on, and especially what happened in the last 2 years, okay? And the drop you see here in 2020 is just because in 2020 we have numbers only until October. We still don't have the numbers of November and of course not of December. But look what happened here in the jump in the number of Palestinians that applied for the Israeli citizenship and actually got it, okay? What we see here is a very interesting phenomenon, and I believe that it's just the beginning of Jerusalem Arabs that are deciding to apply for the Israeli citizenship on all the hardship and the political meaning that such a thing has. Okay, I cannot, we cannot speak about Jerusalem since 1967 and ignore what happened in Jerusalem in the last year since COVID-19 hit us somewhere in the beginning of March of 2020. So here I just put a graph to explain what happened in Jerusalem. Here you can see the first wave of COVID-19 in Jerusalem, and here you can see very clear the second wave. The third wave is happening as we speak. The second wave of COVID-19 in Jerusalem, and you can also see it by population, so you can understand that in the first wave it was mainly an ultra-Orthodox phenomenon. In the middle, you can actually see that in the rest of Jerusalem there was a growth, And then the third wave came with both ultra-Orthodox people and also high morbidity, relatively high morbidity among Arabs in Jerusalem. You see that in the first wave it almost did not exist, but in the second wave it was also very dominant. Actually now in what we call, we hope it's not the third wave, and we hope that vaccination would kick in as quick as possible, but what we see now is that actually the Arab population is the one that is showing the highest morbidity rate in Jerusalem, while the ultra-Orthodox and the rest of Jerusalem is a bit behind. Clearly also what's happening here is affecting unemployment in the city. So these are the latest numbers on what's happening economic-wise in the city. Either unemployment or leave of absence. Here in Israel, there is the option for the employer to do what we call a leave of absence, meaning to let people go, but still keep some kind of a connection to their place of employment. But you can see, of course, that the numbers are relatively high, especially our tourism industry got hit very bad during this crisis. And now here in the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, we're working to try and identify the right leverage, the right engines of growth that will help Jerusalem get out of this crisis as soon as possible once the corona would stand behind, once we'll be in the post-corona or post-COVID-19 era. One last remark that I'm going to have before we'll move to Q&A is about the third sector in Jerusalem, because I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. So definitely, I think that if there's one thing that I convince you during this short lecture is that Jerusalem is relatively a complicated city, although of course there are very interesting topics that are happening in this city. One of the things that we see as that show us that the fact that this is a complicated city, however, a very active city, is the fact that Jerusalem has a very, very strong third sector. In fact, almost a quarter of the total organization, or the total number of organization of third sector organization in Jerusalem, in Israel, are concentrated in Jerusalem. Economy-wise, we're talking about between 15 to 25 billion shekel, which is the budget of third sector of NGOs that are focusing in Jerusalem. We're talking about between 100,000 and 200,000 employees, and between around 200,000 volunteers. Okay, and that's a city that is only 10% of the total population of the country, but it's almost 25 of the total third sector organization, of the total number of NGO. And that's definitely a combination of reasons. One of them is the fact that this is the seat of the government. The other one is the fact that it's a poor city, so definitely there is a lot to do for the third sector. But I think that it's also have to do with the unique nature of Jerusalem. Someone once told me that Jerusalem is the only city in the world in which drinking beer on Shabbat morning is a political statement. And that has something to do, it's true, meaning this city is really a cradle of activism. This city is a city that doesn't let you go. It's always challenging you. It's always pushing you to see who you are, to see what you are, to see how you stand in comparison to other people, to fight for your cause, which is very different than other cities in the world. And that's why we in the Jerusalem Institute are talking a lot about a city of people that want to change the world, Ir shel meshanei olam in Hebrew. So definitely this thing of the third sector, together with other phenomena that are unique for Jerusalem, are showing us that actually there is something in the energy of this city that is rising you to wake up and do something. And that's definitely something very special for this city. So we spoke about the fact that Jerusalem is big, and we spoke about the fact that it's diverse and young and poor, and of course we spoke about the fact that it's complicated. But there is one last thing that I want to leave you with when we spoke about Jerusalem. I don't know if you remember this graph, I showed it in the beginning, and that's the graph that showed the difference between the people that grew up on the Zionist narrative and people that did not grow up on this narrative. And here, this is the pie chart that I showed you in the beginning. Jerusalem in 2017, those are the, let's call them non-Zionist population, and these are the Zionist population. And this is the second graph. This is how Israel is going to be in 2065. So in fact, the same demographic situation, the same diversity that I spoke about so much in Jerusalem could be should be, would be, everyone according to his point of view, the situation in Israel in less than 40 years. And we believe that Jerusalem is also a national lab, meaning that the relationship between those four tribes, as President Ruby Rivlin mentioned, or between the groups, different groups in the population of Israel, are being tested here in Jerusalem. We are being tested here in Jerusalem. And if we would manage to create a relationship between those four tribes, between those different groups, that would help them coexist, then it would shed light on all the people of Israel. Because as I mentioned, the situation in Israel now would be the situation in Israel in 40 years. But if we would fail in Jerusalem, then we are in danger that we would fail also all over Israel. And I think that putting that as a 6th point is a great way to stop for now and move for the Q&As.
Lior, that was fascinating. It was eye-opening, even though it's the second time I'm hearing it. That was extraordinary. I want to feed you some questions that we got earlier on, questions about education and economy and citizenship. So we're going to start from the top. Our first question is, how many Palestinians in East Jerusalem do Bagrut versus Tawjihi, the Jewish kind of, or the Zionist matriculation and the Jordanian matriculation?
Okay, so in general, out of the 110,000 people that are studying in the Arab education system, around 6% are studying according to the Israeli curriculum. Okay, those numbers are from the 1st grade all the way to the 12th grade, while 94% are studying to the Tawji, or the Palestinian/Jordanian system. These numbers are shifting, but very, very slowly. The goal of the government of Israel is that at least 20% of the children, the Palestinian children in Jerusalem, would study according to the Israeli Bagrut system.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that there's kind of activism to move towards that? There are groups that are promoting that?
Well, it's not coming out of civil society. On the contrary, if you look at the civil society in the Palestinian streets, most of them are opposing the movement from the Tawji to the Bagrut. However, in polls that are done by the municipality of Jerusalem among parents, you would see, let's say, a growing desire to have the children move to the Bagrut system. The reason for that is that the Bagrut is being perceived as something that would be more useful in getting jobs in Israel after they will finish the school.
I understand. And we have two similar questions here about participation rate, a few questions about participation rate. The numbers that we saw, do they include people who work in informal jobs and unofficial jobs, kind of this informal economy, people who clean houses, or people who aren't exactly on the books?
Well, that's a question that we're getting a lot, and we don't know for sure. The numbers that I showed are based on both the Bituach Leumi, and Bituach Leumi is the Israeli Social Security, and the Israeli Central Statistic Bureau. In the Israeli Central Statistics Bureau, they're actually asking people. And we believe that when you ask someone, he has less incentive to lie than if it's getting a request from the tax authority. There should be some percentage of Black economy. However, I don't think that it changed completely the numbers. And we should remember that there is Black economy also among non-Haredi Jews. Meaning it's not that people are looking at like the problem of Black economy is usually the problem of Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, but let's remember, when you get paid a low salary, the interest to be part of a Black economy is actually lower. The incentive to be part of a Black economy is growing and growing as you're earning more, and that's more particular for actually the secular and modern Orthodox sectors.
There's a very interesting question here from Ben that I hope I'm able to convey properly. It's about unemployment due to COVID-19. Do we have, or does the center have, the Institute, have in percentage terms compared to participation rate? So in which community has participation rate dropped by the biggest number or percentage?
Well, Ben always asks good question, but I think that this is a bit of a problematic one because while unemployment is being measured monthly, participation rate is being measured yearly. And since we still didn't finish 2020, we actually don't have numbers of participation rate when we talk about the different sectors in Jerusalem. Well, of course, we have the numbers of unemployment. We're monitoring unemployment since March. So I guess that if we'll have this meeting once again in 6 months or something like that, we will be able to do this comparison that Ben is asking for.
Mm-hmm. And Harry also asked you to go back and elaborate a little bit on low participation rate of Arab women, as you suggested.
So actually, we are trying to, since, as mentioned, this is a severe problem, a big problem, but also a big opportunity because it can jump the economy of Jerusalem in significant numbers. And also it's worth mentioning that it already happened, meaning in Israel in 2008, there was a report that was published. It's called the Eckstein report because of Tzvika Eckstein, the #2 in the Israeli bank that led the task force. And they recommended some steps to promote participation among Arab women in Israel. And those steps were implemented and brought to a jump in the numbers of Arab women in Israel. So we believe that can also be done in Jerusalem. So we looked into some of the obstacles for women participation in Jerusalem. The first thing that should be mentioned is, of course, the language. Okay, while most of the job places are in West Jerusalem where people speak Hebrew, most of the Arab women testify that their level of Hebrew is very low to non-existent. Part of it is because the previous question, meaning because they're studying Tawji, they're studying in the Palestinian curriculum, and there the level of studying of Hebrew is very poor, sometimes does not even exist. So that's the first thing. The second thing is cultural problem. Meaning most of the Arab women prefer to work in the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem, while as I mentioned, most of the job places are actually in the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem, and that's of course also a problem. When we talk with all kind of teams here in Jerusalem that are dealing, or agencies that are dealing with employment, they're saying that when an Arab man comes, he would usually ask for a job in West Jerusalem, while when an Arab woman comes, she would usually ask for a job in East Jerusalem. So that's a cultural aspect. And of course, education, okay? Most of the Arab women do not have the level of education that is required for most of the jobs here in Jerusalem. And you can actually see that when a woman is getting a second degree, meaning a master's degree, then her chances to be employed are very high.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Just a moment. So what are migration trends looking like? Do we see secular Jews leaving? Do we see numbers changing in bashva to one another?
So first of all, Jerusalem has a negative immigration rate since the 90s, okay? Between 6,000 to 8,000 people are, meaning the negative immigration rate is between 6,000 to 8,000. It means that every year we're seeing something around between 18 to 20,000 people that are leaving Jerusalem, while only 10 to 12,000 are entering the city. So that's baseline. Now, it is important to mention that most of the big cities around the world have negative immigration rate, that Brooklyn has had negative immigration rate in most of the years in the last 20 years, although it's a very popular area in the last decade or two, that Haifa has a negative migration rate for quite a long time now, and that Tel Aviv, but in 2018 had a negative migration rate in the last 10 years. So that's the first thing. Then let's look at who is living. So the largest group that is living in Jerusalem are Haredi children between the age of 0 to 5. You remember this bar that went above 15%? So that's actually the group that is living the most. Now, every time I'm telling that, I'm thinking of, a toddler that is walking with his small trolley and living in Jerusalem. So of course they're living also with their parents. Okay, here, listen to the number of them. Between the year 2000 to the year 2018, 32,000 Haredi Jews left Jerusalem to the city of Beit Shemesh. In the city of Beit Shemesh, they had an extra 37,000 children. Okay, so those are 70,000 Haredim that left Jerusalem in the last 20 years and either moved or were born in Beit Shemesh. Just imagine what would have happened if those 70,000 would have been in Jerusalem from the pressure on the building here in Jerusalem, not to mention some maybe social pressure, etc., etc. So this is one group that is living, young Haredim that are living with their children. The second group that is living are students that came to Jerusalem to study. I mentioned before that we have 40,000 students here in Jerusalem. Many of them are coming from outside of the city to study in Hebrew U, Bezalel, and other colleges. And many are living after they finish their schools, they're living mainly to Tel Aviv. And the third group that is living are seculars, mainly young couples of seculars and modern Orthodox that cannot afford a housing in Jerusalem. And then usually they would not live to Tel Aviv. The people that are living to Tel Aviv are usually singles, but those young couples would move to the small cities around the city, like to the small communities around the cities, like the city of Modi'in, the city of Mevaseret, the city of Efrat, Ma'ale Adumim, etc., etc.
Avanti. All right. We still have some more questions. So Itai is asking, has Corona led to an increase or decrease in home demolitions in Jerusalem? Are more people building illegally than in previous years due to the pandemic?
Well, that's very hard to say because usually they don't identify illegal building so quickly. And when they do, the procedure, as you know, it is long. We do see, in general, two phenomena in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Let's say three phenomena. One is the fact that the no man's land in those two neighborhoods beyond the wall, the Shuafat refugee camp and Kufr Aqeb, allowed for a cheap solution for young Palestinian couples that were looking for housing. I can elaborate about that, but I think that for itself is worth a whole talk. The second phenomenon is that more and more Palestinians are actually asking for a legal permit to build, and the municipality finally, after 40 years or 45 years, finally a few years ago understood how to work with that, and you see more and more permits are being given. And the third phenomenon is that people that are building illegally prefer to destroy their own houses and not get the fines by the municipality. So actually in the last year or two, we see a lot of talking in the media about people that are actually destroying their own homes because they build illegally and got some kind of warning from the municipality that they should destroy. I don't have the numbers. We don't monitor the numbers daily, but from what we see, that's the three phenomenon that we identify.
Okay. We're also asked here about tourism. What was the tourism market like before COVID-19? Are there plans for development or redevelopment of hotels? And a very interesting question is, will hotel development in East Jerusalem kind of be developed due to the Abraham Accords?
So that's actually a very sad story. The tourism in 2019 was at its highest numbers since ever. Jerusalem passed Eilat as the biggest destination for tourists from both Israel and abroad. It passed Eilat in the number of rooms, hotels rooms here in Jerusalem, and it passed and it set the highest record of tourists that stayed in the city in 2019. Clearly in 2020, this is not the case. And since 82% of the tourists in Jerusalem are coming from abroad, and there is no tourism from abroad whatsoever since March, then you can imagine the crisis. As for East Jerusalem, unfortunately, this prosperity that we saw in tourism in West Jerusalem in the last few years did not shine on East Jerusalem the same way. In fact, if you compare the numbers of rooms in hotels in Jerusalem in 1967 to the number of rooms in hotels in East Jerusalem in 2019, there were more in 1967 than in 2019, and that shows, of course, a big problem in the development of tourism in the city. It's too early to see or say what would be the effect of the Abraham Accords on the tourism in East Jerusalem. Of course, there is a reason for optimism. I would say that the municipality, I would mention that the municipality is developing a big program in Vadi Joz, which is a neighborhood very close to the old city, in which they're going to give a very increased percentage of building rights in the main streets of Vadi Joz, and one of the main purposes is to build hotels in this area. So LD Ben, maybe you should look at it.
All right, Lior, we have two more questions. I know they've been coming at you pretty fast. One of our questions is, how does the society increase our women's participation rate? And then the other question, I'll just kind of let you plan your time, is if you can talk about the citizenship requests that were declined.
Okay, so about the participation rate among women, there are few ways to do it. First of all, for those who can go to higher education, then of course programs that are encouraging women to go to higher education, programs like Mechinot, the prep schools that are helping women that finish their Tauji to learn Hebrew and go into the higher education. We should mention, however, that we see a phenomenon of women that are doing their first degree and never going to the workplace, meaning they're doing their first degree because it's part of some kind of a track, but then they get married and they never look for a job. And yet higher education is one of the ways to bypass this block in the participation rate. The second thing is learning Hebrew, meaning we identify Hebrew as one of the main obstacles, as I mentioned before. So teaching Hebrew, being good in teaching Hebrew, giving good Hebrew schools, good Hebrew lessons, this is also a way. And there are a lot of course, courses, but also civil society organizations that are working on basic Hebrew skills for Arab women. There is a program now of the municipality that is focusing on women that finish the Tauji in, let's say, mid-level grades. So on one hand, they're not going to work in the blue-collar jobs, but on the other hand, they would probably have hardship to go inside the higher education system here in Israel, and they are developing all kinds of tools for this demography, for this group. And of course, investment in East Jerusalem, as I mentioned, many Arab women are looking for a job in East Jerusalem. So as there will be more and more investment in East Jerusalem, we also hope for encouragement of the economy there. For example, we're talking about micro grants for women in East Jerusalem that are working from home. We're looking at all kinds of community centers that would provide jobs for Arab women there, et cetera, et cetera. And as for the last question about the citizenship, so when you are applying for an Israeli citizenship, you need to prove that you don't have any other citizenship, meaning you don't have a Jordanian citizenship. You need to prove that you don't have any criminal record. I think that you need to prove also that nobody of your family has a criminal record. And you also need to prove that you have some kind of control in Hebrew. So you can imagine that all of those three put together are relatively a big obstacle. And that's why from the data that we saw in 2018, for each application that was approved, that was also one application that was declined. However, the Ministry of Interior here in Israel released in a few weeks ago, released a very interesting procedure that allows or would allow people between the age of 18 to 21 that were born in Israel and do not have a Jordanian citizenship to apply to the Israeli citizenship in a very quick lane, and they don't have to follow all the restrictions that I said before. They just need to prove that they were actually born in Jerusalem and they lived in Jerusalem all their life. And if they would do that, they would automatically get the Israeli citizenship. So that happened just a few weeks ago, and we're just monitoring that. But I think that could be a very optimistic news for people that are, for Israeli Arabs, sorry, for Jerusalem Arabs that are interested to take part in the Israeli citizenship or to take the Israeli citizenship.
Wow. Oh my goodness. This was so much to think about, so much to take in. Lior, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank again our partners at the Jerusalem Parliament, at the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, at the municipality through Berutina, and my peers here at the Begin Center. I want to thank you, our audience, for sticking by us, even though we had a little bit of a rough patch at the beginning. It was great to see you all. It was great to learn together. I want to encourage you to follow us on social media, to follow our events, to follow all of our partners' events. We're going to be back here again next week around the same time with Karen Brunwasser talking about Jerusalem activism. And this was wonderful. Thank you very, very much, and have a good day or a good night wherever you are. Thank you, Lior.